When the world changes, so does the food system, the intricate web linking food production and farms all the way to our plates. And if you're feeling the same as me right now, the pace, scale, and unpredictability of change in our world is bewildering.
Great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure.
And in that speech by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney describing the shifting tectonic plates of geopolitics, food got a mention.
A country that can't feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself.
Meanwhile, from Ukraine to Greenland, the Middle East to Latin America, conflict and competition over resources is daily news.
The United States says that it has apprehended 2 oil tankers which are part of a ghost fleet linked to Venezuela.
And it's not only the international political landscape that's changing, so is the UK's physical one. With increasing regularity, farmers talk of weather patterns so extreme, how much food they can produce is anyone's guess.
It's like an inland sea. We're stood looking at water wherever you are, and none of it you'd want to drink. The farm is on an island.
And along with planetary health, there's a renewed sense of urgency over the link between food and human health, with a third of the nation obese. Efforts to intervene and legislate are increasing.
From today, a new ban on adverts for junk food comes into force on social media and on TV and on streaming.
In this edition, we're going to be taking stock of what's been an astonishing start to the year. Luckily, making this food-themed stock take possible is an event that took place last week, in which some of the major players involved in feeding Britain all came together. Think of a Davos dedicated to food, but inside a conference hall in Islington.
The UK has some of the highest obesity rates anywhere in Europe, with conditions such as diabetes reaching unprecedented levels, especially amongst young people.
At this conference, Britain's most powerful food retailer, Ken Murphy, CEO of Tesco, was joining the dots between health, food security and the environment.
We must treat this year as a wake-up call rather than sleepwalking into what could become a national emergency.
Government Minister Dame Angela Eagle was there, with a particular focus on poor diets and poverty.
Something's gone very wrong with our food system when a third of children are leaving school obese.
Meanwhile, the author of the National Food Strategy, Henry Dimbleby, delivered a talk to food industry players in which he listed the environmental impacts of the current food system.
The biggest cause of, by far, of natural destruction, second biggest cause of climate change, biggest cause of eutrophication of the pollution of water, biggest cause of them.
This event, the Sustainable Foods Conference, is an opportunity for the supply chain to come together and look ahead to the prospect of even more change, which Henry Dimbleby believes includes not only climate change, but also more medication.
I think we have entered a decade of unparalleled disruption in the food system, and that is going to be very commercial disruption. And there are 2 primary things that are causing that. One is appetite suppressants, and if you have 40% of the population who want to lose weight, it's hard to see a future where you can't decide your weight and how many of those people are going to want to be obese. And that means, for the first time ever, lower volumes. The only way to increase profit is to increase price, reduce costs, or gain share. So it's just a very different competitive environment. The other area is climate and production disruptions. So we in this country have had the first year where we had a temperature over 40. We then had a very wet 23-24 winter. We then had this terrible dry spring. And so that has gone to being a very commercial thing. So what I talked about is not what do you need to be doing for social reasons, but how are you going to survive this disruption in which, in my view, the customers will be thinking about eating food in a way they've never done before, and you'll have these climate change issues and tariff wars, geopolitics, real hot wars to deal with. And so there are huge risks for these companies if they don't get that right, but there are also opportunities. In short, I'm quite excited about this because money talks, and suddenly it's about money. Health is about money, and supply chain and disruption is about money.
I'm Hussein Alawi, the founder and director of the Sustainable Foods Conference.
The event is in its 5th year, and in that time, Hussein has seen how even the use of the word sustainable has evolved, with more and more emphasis being placed on resilience.
So it began really with the kind of focus on environmental sustainability. And, some say, well, sustainability is now in retreat, given what's happening in the US and other countries. But frankly, we see the opposite because it's just being renamed something different. So, for example, there's a greater focus on resilience and on the supply chain. And, arguably, this is exactly the same thing as sustainability, just called something different. So within food and drink, the challenges are, really quite systemic, and they are found across the world.
Take fresh water, for example. Last month, the UN announced in a new report how our world is entering a new phase it calls water bankruptcy. More of the planet's river basins and aquifers are losing the ability to return to their historical normal, it says. Droughts, shortages and pollution events that once looked like temporary shocks are becoming chronic in many places. And when it comes to growing food, this, of course, is a serious problem.
My name is Ali Belad, and I'm a farmer in Morocco, citrus farmer.
Ali is one of a growing number of producers in North Africa supplying us, the UK, with food. Each year, we import more than £500 million worth of fresh produce from Morocco. But as he told me at the conference, he's witnessing a catastrophic decline in available water.
We've been, in case of Morocco, in the last 7 years, we've seen a huge change of water because of the heavy drought, and the impact was terrible for farmers. We could see it in the wells. Personally, in one of our farms, we had a decrease of 90% of the water, even more. We had to abandon part of the farm, and we've seen a lot of small farmers who are quitting farming because of the drought. Yeah.
And do you think what Morocco, perhaps what North Africa more widely is experiencing, is something that actually more of us should start to engage with as people who are recipients of the food system? One of the big future challenges for food production, water.
Water will be I think, the major issue. So Morocco has, as a government, taken some big action, for example, on the desalination plants. So all the export farming area will be covered by desalinized water, but it will cost. Will be a big shift in the next few years.
This, the UN says, is having a knock-on effect on food prices, employment, migration, and geopolitical stability. An analysis that's shared by another contributor at the conference, a major player in the food system we rarely get to hear from, the logistics business, the controllers of the ports and ships that move food around the world.
I'm Nicholas Matzi. I'm Vice President for Sustainability in the Europe region for DP World. DP World is an end-to-end supply chain services business, starting out with ports and terminals globally, but also now includes road transport, logistics, warehousing, ferries, and our feeder vessel service as well, so shipping.
And where do you operate?
All over the world. So in the UK, we have ports in London Gateway and Southampton, and Europe in Antwerp, Rotterdam, Romania, Turkey, and globally, every region has ports, terminals, and logistics. So we really are a true global end-to-end logistics business.
Take the citrus grown in Morocco by Ali Balad, the farmer we heard from earlier. DP World oversees the supply chain from the farms in North Africa to the cold stores of British supermarkets.
We run a shipping service and logistics service that goes from Agadir in Morocco, and we move fresh fruits and vegetables, lots of citrus fruits from Morocco to the UK and to Belgium. And then we transport it from our port and London gateway to our customers' distribution centres.
And if you're picturing the business of logistics as nothing more than a glorified taxi service for fruit and veg, simply moving produce from A to B, think again. These logistics operators are increasingly in the business of risk analysis and putting in place long-term strategies to make sure food supplies keep moving around the world.
The importance about it is understanding what are the issues in that supply chain, solving that for the customers. And one of those big issues is scarcity of water, so drought from climate change, huge problem. Biodiversity loss, which is impacting the ability for crops to be able to be propagated, just like we would expect them to do. But if there's no bees, if there's no insects, these things can really impact the ability of these crops to grow. So we work with our customers all the way from the farm, all the way up to the distribution center, the retailer, to help them understand what is your climate, nature risk? How can we make that supply chain more resilient? How do we work with you to solve those problems? We bring in water solutions, for example, with the farmers if they're in drought, so that we can ensure that when you, the consumer, get your broccoli or your citrus fruits or your tomatoes, you can make sure that's going to be a continuous supply, is high quality and resilient.
Water shortages are a massive problem for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this links very closely to geopolitical risks at the same time. So water scarcity is going to be driving movement of people, but it's also driving conflict. Those of your listeners who are aware of the challenges in Iran, the awful conditions we're seeing there in situation, well, Tehran is almost out of water completely. Iran's aquifers are almost empty as well. So the social issues, the economic issues that we're seeing in Morocco, Iran, a lot of these are related to scarcity of water. Sometimes we have too much water at the wrong time. Sometimes we have no water at all. I think last year we had the periods of greatest drought the UK has seen in about 50 years. That was in the northern part of Europe. In the southern part of Europe, they had greatest floods that they've seen for a long time. So we're seeing climate changes heavily impacting our food security, our water security, and it impacts supply chains.
Does that mean that you are looking around the world at potential new supply chains?
Yes, that's exactly what we do, and to help secure food supply chains for the UK. It's on the UK's national security strategy. Food security is down. It's not now just about tanks and drones and bullets. It's very much around where do we get our food from? Where do we get our pharmaceuticals from? How do we make sure that supply is resilient in the next 10, 20, 30 years? But we also look at other places as well. We look in areas in Asia Pacific. We have programs and projects that we want to bring more fresh fruit and veg from China, things that we can't get here. So every company and every person needs to think about where am I going to get my raw materials from, and fruit and veg are no different.
Nicholas Mazzei from DP World. More insights from the Sustainable Foods Conference in a moment, because it's worth taking a closer look at the idea of food being part of the UK's national security strategy. In the same week, the World Economic Forum took place, and perhaps drowned out by news coverage of Trump's speech, Carney's analysis, and Macron's sunglasses, the government released a document titled Nature Security Assessment on Global Biodiversity Loss. A 14-page report highlighting how our resilience, security, and prosperity are all at risk if we see a further decline in planetary health. And what's really important to understand about this document is that, although published by DEFRA, the BBC understands much of the analysis on food security came from the UK's intelligence services. Over to BBC climate reporter Mark Pointing.
Yeah, this report was published by DEFRA, but I understand it was put together by the Joint Intelligence Committee, which oversees the security services like MI5, MI6 and GCHQ, in addition to input across government. And the report is significant because it's really the first time that the loss of biodiversity and the collapse of ecosystems has been officially recognised as a national security risk. And now, of course, we've known about the loss of biodiversity in nature for some time. A major report back in 2019 from the UN said that the rate of change in nature worldwide since 1970 was unprecedented in human history. But this is really the first time that the evidence of how it will affect the UK or how it could affect the UK has been drawn together by the security services. It's also worth noting that the report was due to come out in October, but it was widely reported that it was blocked by Number 10 because it was feared it would be seen as too negative, and it was finally released earlier in January following some freedom of information requests from environmental groups.
And what are the risks highlighted in this 14-page report, Mark?
Yeah, the version online is 14 pages, although I understand there's a longer version that's been circulated within DEFRA, and it really draws on scientific research as well as some expert judgment from the security services to come up with what it calls as a reasonable worst-case scenario for how biodiversity loss could affect UK security. And its conclusions are really quite stark. The first line of the report says global ecosystem degradation and collapse threatens the UK's national security and prosperity. It draws attention to 6 ecosystems which it says are on the pathway to collapse, although it's really uncertain as to when that will happen and how long it could take. So some of those ecosystems are the rainforests in the Amazon and the Congo Basin, boreal forests of Russia and Canada, and also areas of Southeast Asia and the Himalayas. And what it warns is that there could be cascading risks if those ecosystems were to collapse. It points to the risk of conflict and migration, but also it draws heavy attention really to the possible implications for food security.
And if those risks do start to cascade, what could happen to our food?
The UK, of course, relies heavily on imports for food. The report says about 40% of the UK's food comes from overseas. And of course, the UK's own food production is threatened by nature loss and extreme weather linked to climate change. I'm sure many of our listeners will remember the very wet winter a couple of winters ago in 2023-24, and the flooding and the impacts that had on farming, but also the dry summer of 2025. But what this report really says is that UK food security is also threatened by what's going on in other parts of the world. It says that degradation or collapse of some of those ecosystems that I mentioned earlier will challenge the UK's food security because it's really reliant on imports of food and fertiliser. But it also does say that there's kind of no easy solution here. The report says that the UK is unable to be food self-sufficient based on current diets and prices. And if we wanted to become fully self-sufficient, then that would also require big price increases for consumers. So it really highlights the vulnerabilities to the UK food security system. But in response to the report being released, DEFRA said that it was still confident that the UK did have a resilient food system. It said it was one of the most food secure nations in the world, and that access to international trade helped to supplement domestic production.
Now that it's been published, what happens next? Who or what is supposed to act on this analysis?
Yeah, the government says that the report will help it to prepare better for the future. It acknowledged that nature underpinned the UK security. And now environmentalists really want the government to show increased urgency on tackling the loss of biodiversity and climate change. They want the UK to help both in its own efforts to cut emissions, but also supporting other countries to protect nature and tackle climate change. They are worried, the environmentalists, they see the government retreating from some of its promises on nature. At the COP30 climate summit in Brazil in late 2025, it didn't commit public funds to an effort to protect tropical rainforests that the Brazilian hosts had wanted to get off the ground, although the UK still says it wants to contribute in the future when circumstances allow. And it says that the private sector will contribute too. But the government does point to its investments in flood defences and efforts for sustainable food production, which it says will help to protect the UK from the impacts of climate change and nature loss. But it's clear that from this report that the UK could still face some really significant challenges as climate change and nature loss continues around the world.
Climate reporter Mark Pointing. Someone who's spent the last few years researching the scale of nature loss caused by the food system is Michael Grunwald, author of We Are Eating the Earth, The Race to Fix Our Food System and Save Our Climate.
So when I say we are eating the earth, I mean agriculture is eating the earth. And we talk a lot about how our cities and suburbs are kind of sprawling into nature, but they only cover about 1% of the land on Earth. Our farms and pastures cover 40% of the land on Earth. It's the equivalent of all of Asia plus all of Europe. We are losing a soccer field worth of tropical forest to agriculture every 6 seconds. And because of that, agriculture is now the leading driver of deforestation, of water pollution, of water shortages. It uses 70% of our fresh water, and it's now also contributing about 1/3 of our carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions. So agriculture is already this outsized environmental problem, and it is continuing to get worse every day. We are on track to deforest another dozen Californias worth of land by 2050. And we don't have another dozen Californias worth of forest to spare.
Progress is being made when it comes to future energy supplies. For example, the acceleration of electrification in some parts of the world. But when it comes to food, we're way behind, says Michael.
So even if all 8 billion of us stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow, we would still be on track to blow through our climate targets because of our food and agriculture problems. They're about 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's partly because we use fossil fuels in our diesel tractors and other farm equipment, and it's partly because our cattle burp and fart a lot of methane, which sounds goofy but is a real problem, and it's partly because a lot of synthetic fertilizer is literally manufactured from natural gas. But the main reason that agriculture is such a climate problem is because it's eating the earth. And I always say that trying to decarbonize the planet while continuing to chop down forests for agriculture is like trying to clean up your house while smashing your vacuum cleaner to bits in the living room. You make a gigantic mess, right? Because you're blasting all that carbon from the forests and wetlands into the sky. But you're also crippling your ability to clean up that mess, because today forests and wetlands soak up about 1/4 of our carbon emissions. So this really is just, it's a climate problem as well as a biodiversity problem and a pollution problem and all kinds of other environmental problems.
It's that set of complex interactions the UK's Climate Change Committee advises the government on. The independent scientific body which provides guidance on emissions targets and sets carbon budgets. And as more progress is made on energy, it's the food system that's coming under greater scrutiny.
So from about 2040 onwards, a lot of the emissions in the economy are coming from food production and from changes in land for food production. So let's look at agriculture.
Speaking at the Sustainable Foods Conference was Emma Pinchbeck, Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. To reach current emissions targets, she explained, the advice to government is for less land to be used for livestock and for our diet to feature less meat, a trend that's already underway.
We actually start our expectation of meat eating above what people are already doing in our advice, and that's because we assume that one of the reasons people are eating less meat at the moment is cost of living, and there might be a rebound effect. And we're talking about a 25% shift away from meat and a 20% shift away from dairy by 2040 in the advice, and that's against pre-pandemic levels. That's an average reduction across the UK population, so it includes people who are wholly vegan and people who are just cutting down less. It's roughly in line with the NHS advice. And we expect it to be achieved by people making different choices rather than a kind of stick on the supply side, for example, making meat more expensive. In our advice, making the alternatives cheaper gets you, we think, that trend line needed for emissions reduction.
And if you're wondering what that meat reduction looks like,
is if you are someone who eats 8 kebabs a week. We are asking you to eat 6 kebabs a week, and that gets you roughly in line with the amount of meat in the 7th carbon budget pathway. If you're thinking, who would eat 6 kebabs a week? Congratulations, you're right. That's a hefty amount of meat anyway. So I think the scale of it can often be overpunted.
That's the diet, but what does this mean for farmers and the British landscape? The current advice from the Climate Change Committee is for more mixed farming, greater biodiversity, along with a rethink on livestock.
So already lots of farmers are thinking about things like breeding programs to prioritise animals that produce less methane, managing their livestock differently, and all of that has made a difference. But the biggest chunk of emissions from agriculture comes from simply having livestock on the land, and so that we haven't seen much of a shift there, and that's the bit of the puzzle that we need to think about going forward. Now, the other thing we say as a Climate Change Committee is the land is really important as a carbon sink. So there are loads of opportunities to plant trees, restore peatland, biodiversity gain, to grow crops, to have on-site renewables, to do all kinds of things with that land. And in the way that we've thought about it, for every cow or sheep we take off the land, we put on something else. And what that does overall is it makes farmers and landowners part of the solution to climate change, not the problem, and it gives them an income. And overall, when we've looked at different kinds of farmers benefit from a net zero world, following our recommendations and one where we stay as we are.
Emma Pinchbeck, Chief Executive of the UK's Climate Change Committee. For more in-depth coverage of the debate on meat, livestock and the food system, in the Food Programme archive on BBC Sounds, you'll find a range of different programmes, including our mini-series from a few years ago, Eating Animals. Let's move on from the food system and its impacts on planetary health and explore a second question on the agenda of the Sustainable Foods Conference. How can we make food healthier? It's a question that's also back on the political agenda. On January the 5th, the so-called junk food advertising ban came into force, a version of which featured in Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, published back in 2021.
The advertising ban it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. I think that's going to be quite a fundamental change. At the moment...
Just explain why.
Because they've restricted junk food ads to after 9 p.m. and they're going to take them away online completely. They haven't restricted them on posters, so you're going to begin to see the system response will be loads of junk food advertising on posters. But I think it's quite... I talked to companies who went early on the online advertising before Christmas. It really hurt them. And so I think that's going to be quite interesting.
For a quick recap on the ban, I need to explain two acronyms, NPM and HFSS. The first, the nutrient profile model, is the scoring system developed to classify food and drink products as less healthy or healthier based on their nutritional composition. Think of the NPM as the calculator that determines if a product is HFSS, high in fat, salt or sugar, and therefore if it's covered by the advertising ban. What's also important to know is that as well as the advertising restrictions coming into force, January also saw the government announcing a new and potentially stricter NPM, which, if introduced, will result in more foods being covered by the ban. Someone who's following the twists and turns of this story is Ian Quinn of The Grocer magazine.
The health lobby very pleased, and lots of NGOs and charities and scientists are welcoming the move, saying it's about time too. But the food industry, or large parts of it anyway, is up in arms, and they claim that the government, just weeks after bringing in the junk food advertising ban, is now moving the goalposts again and making things even tougher. So a lot happening. Obviously, we have to see now whether the government actually go ahead and do this.
And how different is this new nutrient profile model that's being proposed? Very different, says Henry Dimbleby.
Now, this is very geeky, but actually it's pretty fundamental. You're going to see a huge backlash for this. So it's done two really fundamental things. One is that it has changed added sugars to free sugars. A free sugar is a sugar that has been come out of the cell in the plant in which it was, which means that things like the starch in in cornflakes becomes a sugar. Cornflakes suddenly are seen as a sugary food, which they haven't been in the past. It's a disaster for fruit juices and smoothies. So that is going to be really contested. And the other thing that they've done is that they have just slightly in other areas changed the boundaries, not by that much. But you're already seeing backlash from the industry going, oh my God, we've done all of this reformulation and now we're going to have to go again.
Taking that view is Danone, the global food and drinks business with its origins in dairy and now brands such as Activia and Alpro. At the conference, I met its president for North Europe, James Mayer.
Over 90% of our portfolio is made up of products not high in fat, sugar or salt. That doesn't happen by accident. That's the result of many years of concerted effort around reformulation and also choices about the portfolio of products we put into a market like the UK.
So what have you got rid of?
We've got rid of products at times which are high in fat, sugar and salt, and we don't believe there was a way to reformulate them in a way.
Just to illustrate,
certain parts of our dairy portfolio, so a part of the Activia range, we delisted from the UK market. There wasn't a way to successfully reformulate that, to make that consistent with what we set out to do. The thing we need to recognise is reformulation takes years to do. You have to bring consumers on a journey. The most important criteria for each of us when we choose a particular food is how it tastes. There are other factors, of course, but taste is important. You can't move from left to right on a nutritional profile of a product. You have to do that in increments over time. So the portfolio we have as a business today is the result of concerted work over many years and then choices about how we innovate.
That innovation, years of work, and Danone says millions of pounds of investment has all been based on the current nutrient profile model.
If we are now to change those goalposts, it will lead to a lack of confidence to invest from the industry. It will also lead to confusion amongst consumers because you're then going to create a much bigger bucket of products which are deemed as unhealthy because they'll be deemed as high in fat, sugar and salt. So my only request is we consult widely on whether it's right to change NPM. Let's think about the consequences of shifting the goalposts for industry and causing more confusion with consumers.
But when she talked at the conference, and also to me, DEFRA Minister Dame Angela Eagle was very clear on the scale of the problem and the need for more action.
For too long, I think, we've framed the challenges of the food system, particularly food poverty and obesity, as a matter of individual responsibility rather than a collective responsibility and a matter of the food environment. There is a systemic problem that we need to tackle. And I feel uniquely privileged that the food system...
We need a system that doesn't lead to 30% of our children leaving school obese, which costs our health services 74 billion a year, the cost of obesity, not just children. So we've got to think of a way of reforming our system so that it actually does good rather than harm. And I think I'd like to see that done cooperatively. But if we have to get to the stage where we shift change along a bit faster, then I'd like to see that happening as well.
Including the revised NPM.
We want to see the changes in that profiling model and we want to try to encourage the industry to reformulate as quickly as possible so that we can deal with some of the issues that I was talking about earlier with obesity. We want food to be healthy, nutritious and not to cause health problems for as many people as are being caused health problems at the moment. So if we can do that cooperatively and quickly, so much the better.
Is that going out to public consultation?
Yes, that's right, but it's based on the science. Obviously, we'll be listening to what everybody says, but I mentioned earlier in our interview the issues we're dealing with in terms of the obesity crisis, the junk food cycle, if I'm going to quote Mr. Dimbleby. We've got to start breaking that way of doing things. We've got to get to the stage where we break the link which I never thought we'd see, between obesity and poverty.
People might be thinking, does advertising really have that much impact?
Well, I'm not sure they'd spend quite the amount of money they spend on advertising food, especially aimed at children, that they do in the food industry if it didn't have that effect. And we're going to find out, aren't we?
Dame Angela Eagle, Minister of State for Food Security and Rural Affairs. There was a talk at the event which set out an even more radical approach to reshaping a nation's diet. It was presented by Dr. David Unwin, a GP in Southport, just north of Liverpool, who's appeared on the food programme before, describing how, by prescribing a low-carb, high-protein diet, he's transformed the lives of patients diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. At the Sustainable Foods Conference, he had some news to share.
Which of you in the audience are aware of the historic changes in the American dietary guidelines that happened 10 days ago? Could you put your hands up if you know? So not everybody knows.
On one side of a screen, Dr. Unwin was showing the UK's dietary guidelines featuring fruits, vegetables, bread, pasta, rice, low-fat spreads, semi-skimmed milk, along with a small portion of crisps and ice cream. Whereas on the other side of the screen were the new and very different American food guidelines.
So this is the dietary guidelines for Americans, published and will not be changed until 2030. And in these guidelines, you can see the starchy carbs are down at the bottom, now the smallest thing in diet. And what's right at the top there is they're advising a doubling of protein, leading on green veg, with a graduation in between. Please notice the whole milk. Okay, the Americans are finished with skimmed milk, absolutely finished with it. It's whole milk now, and it's butter and cream. And this is evidence-based. So you must be thinking, how is it that America has turned on its own junk food industry? I mean, whoever thought I would live to see the day when Washington would say that we should be abandoning junk food, and that there is no amount of added sugar is a good idea in meals. It's absolutely astonishing.
Care of the controversial US Secretary of State for Health, RFK Jr., along with MAHA Mums, that's the Make America Healthy Again movement, and some say the beef industry, these new dietary guidelines feature more steak, whole milk, and cooking with butter, and a clear no to processed foods and sugar. A radical move that's going to be fascinating to watch, says David Unwin.
I've never ever seen anything like this. What they've done is they've turned what we think of as the food pyramid, basing meals on starchy carbohydrates, and then lower down the pyramid you're adding protein and fats. They've turned it literally upside down. They're advising that people double the amount of dietary protein they have, increase green vegetables, eat a lot more full-fat dairy. This is a completely new thing. The idea of full-fat dairy, whole milk, butter, cheese is what they're advising. And then there's the things they don't want you to have anymore. So they have said that added sugar should have no part in the diet. None. And to find an American government, the home of ultra-processed food, where it all began in so many ways, waging war on their own ultra-processed food industry. They're saying avoid ultra-processed packaged foods, avoid them. To have a government advising that, I never thought I'd live to see the day. It's astonishing, because what starts in America comes over here. But I have to tell you, what's relevant to me is the sort of diet that this pyramid is suggesting is very similar. The American dietary guidelines are now suggesting the very diet that I've been using in my own practice at Norwood Avenue for 12 years. My patients have been, as it were, experimenting with this diet now suggested by the American dietary guidelines, with more protein, more green veg, a lot less sugar and a lot less carbohydrate. So low carb, high protein, low carb diet. They've been doing this for 12 years. And to my surprise, despite the full fat milk and the cream and the butter, all the measures we have for cardiovascular risk have all improved, and we've published with Professor Roy Taylor in BMJ Nutrition, showing that this change in diet has brought about improvements in cardiovascular risk, which I didn't expect when we started.
They are guidelines, in effect recommendations.
Yes.
To what extent are they realistic, particularly in terms of the American food system and the environment that people eat and live in?
You've just asked a fascinating question. The implementation of this, I can't wait to watch. At least, I've got a fireside seat here. I can't wait to watch, because they now need to implement this. This is how you need to feed the army. This is what has to happen in schools. And I think the reason this is important throughout the world is this will have an effect on agriculture, because who's going to supply all this food? And it will impact, the ripples will go across the world. I'm just so interested to see the next 5 years implementation. But if we could see in schools them having whole milk, if we could see them eating vegetables, if we could see them having proper meals instead of buns and pizza and chips, I would be very pleased. So skeptical, can't wait to watch what happens next.
Dr. David Unwin, all of the stories we heard at the Sustainable Food Conference, from food security to GLP-1s, advertising bans to agriculture and climate change, will feature in future editions of the Food Programme in 2026. Keep listening, because when it comes to food, we are living in very interesting times.